Fox News ripped the idea of a minimum wage increase, and you have Art Laffer here, the world's worst economist, call it, quote, ridiculous. Take a look.
I think where we really face the problem is 2022 on. That's where the growth rates are going to be badly damaged by these stimulus packages and all the overhang, all the regulations, a $15 minimum wage. How ridiculous can that be? 40% of the people in Kentucky, working people in Kentucky, are $15 or less. I mean, you're going to kill segments of the economy.
Well, that's going to make it much more expensive for businesses to operate, obviously, to have to pay that out. And it will hurt them, probably lead them to cut jobs, which is, of course, not the intent.
And by regions of the country, too, Maria, it's really very, very bad. It may not be so bad in San Francisco and New York City, but I'll tell you, in Louisville and some of the mountain areas, it's going to be terrible. In the inner cities, it's going to be awful. And it goes against the most vulnerable people, the poor, the minorities, the disenfranchised, the young. It just ruins their prospects for a better life.
So his argument is, I'm against raising the minimum wage because it would ruin your prospect for a better life. I care so much about the poor and minorities that I'm against raising the minimum wage. That's why, because I care about people at the bottom of the economic ladder. Have you ever heard a worse argument than that? I mean, this guy is so full of shit, it's coming out of his ears. He called a minimum wage increase, a $15 minimum wage, quote, ridiculous. He also said that growth is going to go down because of the stimulus. I mean, that just shows his conception of economics is exactly backwards. Like, he couldn't be more wrong. We know, as a matter of fact, and from looking at history, no, when there's an economic downturn and you do stimulus spending, then growth goes up. You do better. You know, think of the Great Depression and the New Deal. What happened? The government is the spender of last resort and did a jobs program and made it so that the economy rebounded. Even World War II and the spending around World War II, that was stimulus. So growth went up. He makes it seem like, no, that's gonna make it go in the other direction. No, if you do nothing, if you do austerity politics, it goes in the wrong direction. I mean, there's never been a person more wrong on economics than Art Laffer at every step of his life, and he's been the person who is a top advisor to a lot of the Republican presidents. I think going all the way back to Ronald Reagan. You know, he's the trickle-down economics guy. Couldn't be more wrong. Now, to go back to the minimum wage here, 17 million workers would be helped by it. 17 million workers. 900,000 would be lifted out of poverty. And that's, again, the official poverty line. I would argue that the actual poverty line is higher than what they say it is. So, these numbers are from the CBO, and they're so questionable. I don't know if I'd take them to the bank. But even according to their numbers, 17 million workers helped, 900,000 lifted out of poverty. The other thing is, and this is the part that's not discussed nearly enough, you actually would shrink government programs if you raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Why? Because a lot of those programs that exist for the people at the bottom of the economic ladder, people wouldn't need to use those programs anymore. Millions more people wouldn't need to use those programs because right now, if you're making a starvation wage, somebody's got to make up the difference, and so you go to the government for effectively whatever it is, SNAP, welfare, whatever, to help you pay the bills. And so if you're forcing these big corporations to pay $15 an hour and to pay a living wage, then people don't qualify for and don't need anymore a lot of these programs which are for the poorest among us. And so there would be a net shrink, a net reduction in the size of government. And that's something that Art Laffer should support because, he says he's a small government conservative. If you want to shrink government, increasing the minimum wage is definitely one way to do that because then you could make these programs that support people a little smaller. So, but again, of course that doesn't factor into his thinking because he cares more. He won't say this part, but the reality is the big corporations don't want to raise the wage by and large, and he's going to side with those big corporations because the entire, Republican establishment in Washington, D.C., their whole existence is just to do propaganda for and support corporate America, the billionaire class, the owner class, the CEOs. And so that's the real concern here. The real concern is I care more about padding the bottom line for these giant corporations, and I know that they don't want to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, so I'm going to take that side as well. And the other thing is, you would think that, so if that was a real concern of his, oh my God, I'm afraid of job loss, why wouldn't he support another way of addressing that problem? So if you think that an increase in the minimum wage is going to lead to job loss, why wouldn't Art Laffer say, well, we should raise the minimum wage to a living wage. It should be 15, but the government should subsidize, the businesses that are going to fire people so that they could keep those people on the payroll. Why wouldn't he say that? Why wouldn't he say that? Because his argument is, oh my God, it might lead to job loss. Therefore, we need to keep paying people starvation wages. Which is a terrible idea, obviously. The other thing is, if you really were concerned about job loss in various places, another way to address that problem is an idea I've talked about on the show before, which is you can craft a federal law on the minimum wage that makes it a living wage in every county in the United States of America. And so in rural Wyoming, it might be $9.25. That might be the living wage. And in New York, it might be $24.50. So if you crafted it that way, that's another way to address the problem and not have as much job loss, but he doesn't approach it that way because he wants to keep paying starvation wages. He wants to make it so that we still have an underclass that works full-time and doesn't make enough money to survive. And there's another good point that was made by Dan Price on this. He said that, so if we take the CBO numbers and we're going to lose 1 million jobs or so as a result of raising the minimum wage to a living wage, you have to understand that some of those jobs that are going to be lost are actually second jobs for people. They're second jobs. So somebody could work 2 jobs and make $7.25 an hour at each of those jobs. And then, so they lose one of those jobs when you raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And now they're working one job and they're getting paid more, $15 an hour. So is it really the worst thing in the world to get rid of that kind of a job that pays a starvation wage, and to make it so that this person could have an easier life and they get paid better and they don't have to work as many hours? I mean, you could argue if there was ever such thing as like a moral and ethical job loss, well, fuck, right? Like the details of that are kind of overwhelming, are they not? And then the final point is, what they're saying is not even necessarily true, okay? Is it possible that there's some uptick in unemployment if you raise the minimum wage to a living wage? Yeah, it's possible, for sure. There's also studies on the other side of that which say that doesn't happen. And there's also the anecdotal evidence of what it's like in countries that effectively have a living wage right now. The example we like to give on the show is Australia. In Australia, they have about a $15 in US dollars minimum wage, and their unemployment rate is the exact same as ours. Think about that. So they effectively pay a $15 minimum wage, a living wage, and their unemployment rate's the same as ours. So what happened? I thought you guys were going to tell me that it's going to lead to extreme job loss and it'll lead to a dystopian hellscape future. That didn't manifest. It didn't manifest in Australia. It doesn't manifest in the Scandinavian countries. And by the way, in the Scandinavian countries, they don't even have a minimum wage because most people are unionized. And if they're unionized, they make even more than what would be a minimum wage. And is there, extreme job loss and extreme unemployment in a lot of these countries, respectively? No. There are places in the U.S., that already have a $15 minimum wage. And is there extreme job loss in those places that's totally not comparable to other places around the U.S.? No, there isn't. So even if there was an increase in unemployment, you could say it's negligible. And the net good of paying a living wage, lifting so many people out of poverty, it's worth it, man. It's worth it. I really do think as a matter of principle, we shouldn't have a situation where you could work a full-time job and not make enough money to survive. If you're working a full-time job, you should be able to make enough money to survive, period. So, of course, Fox News is going to go strong against raising the minimum wage to a living wage. Again, he said it's, quote, ridiculous. And he said it ruins people's prospects for a better life. Imagine that. Raising wages for people at the bottom ruins their prospects for a better life. Absurd. And by the way, the other thing is, the argument they make that this is only like kids who make the minimum wage. Bullshit. There are plenty of people who that is their job. And they simply don't care about these people. They think that if you're earning really low wages, you just deserve it. Like, you just deserve to make a starvation wage. You know? Then you definitely can't say this is a meritocracy. If you have people who work full-time and bust their ass and still don't make enough money to survive, you can't then turn around and say, well, just work harder. If you just work harder, you'll make it and you'll go far. These people literally argue that you should be able to work full-time and not make enough money to survive. What do you mean just work harder? What do you mean you value work? That quite literally proves you do not value work. If you valued work, you'd want to pay people at least a living wage if they work full-time. So it's all bullshit, and it's all just working backwards from their conclusion that the corporations are always right, the billionaires are always right, and if that means you have to make a starvation wage, so be it. So this is so everybody understands, if anybody has fallen into that trap of thinking the Republicans or Fox News or whatever, or working class, are for the working class, hilarious, laugh along with me.